federal business!
You don't get to stall. You don't get to question this.
Is this legal? Can you show me your badge?
You have 10 seconds! Open the door, we force entry! 10, 9, 8,
It was just after 8:40 a.m. when Linda Harper, a 52-year-old administrative assistant, heard the knock. Not loud, not rushed, 3 firm taps, practiced, deliberate. Her house sat on a quiet street in Aurora, Colorado, the kind of neighborhood where nothing urgent ever knocked that early. Beige siding, trimmed hedges, a flag on the porch that hadn't been replaced since last summer. When she opened the inner door and looked through the glass, she saw 2 men. Both were white, mid-30s to early 40s, athletic builds, short, regulation haircuts. Dark windbreakers with FBI lettering stitched cleanly across the chest, not printed stitched. One held a leather folder. The other stood slightly back, scanning the street, eyes moving, alert but controlled. They didn't look nervous, they looked comfortable. "Ma'am, Federal Bureau of Investigation," the taller one said when she cracked the door. "We need to speak with you regarding your son." That sentence landed hard. Linda hadn't heard from Ethan in 3 weeks. He was 24, moved between construction jobs. Had a history of bad decisions, nothing violent, nothing major, but enough to make that sentence feel dangerous. She asked for a warrant. The man didn't raise his voice. He smiled, not friendly, not cruel. "Ma'am, we don't need to escalate this, but if you refuse to cooperate, we will enter. I'd rather not do that in front of your neighbors." The second man stepped closer to the door. Linda later said that was the moment her stomach dropped. Not because she believed them, but because she didn't know if she was allowed to doubt them. They spoke fast, confident, legal language layered with urgency, phrases like protective custody, asset hold, and temporary compliance. They told her Ethan had been connected to an ongoing federal investigation, that no charges had been filed yet, that things could stay that way if she cooperated. When she hesitated again, the taller agent leaned in slightly. "If you don't open the door, we'll come in ourselves. And that never looks good later." Linda unlocked the door. What happened next would take less than 12 minutes, and it would cost her everything she had saved over 23 years. The case file shows no record of any FBI operation at that address that morning. According to Linda Harper's initial statement, the men never raised their voices. They didn't rush her. They didn't touch her, not at first. Once inside, they positioned themselves naturally, as if they'd done this hundreds of times. One stood near the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The other sat at the dining table without being invited, placing the leather folder down carefully, aligning it with the edge. Control through posture, not force. They told Linda the visit was preventive, that Ethan had been flagged during a multi-state fraud probe involving stolen equipment and cash transfers. No arrests yet, no charges. But his name was on a short list. The man with the folder opened it just enough for her to see papers, seals, signatures, dense paragraphs of legal formatting. Linda wouldn't later be able to recall any specific wording, only that it looked official enough to stop her from asking again. "This isn't about punishment," the shorter man said. "It's about leverage." They explained that federal investigations often required temporary financial holds, cash savings, liquid assets that could be secured to prevent interference or flight risk. Linda said she told them she didn't understand how her money related to her son. "That's exactly why we're here," the taller one replied. "So you don't have to understand it publicly." The implication was clear. They told her Ethan had already cooperated informally, that he'd mentioned his mother kept savings at home, money from years of work. Some of it never moved to a bank after a bad experience with identity theft. That detail mattered. It felt specific, too specific to be random. Linda walked to the bedroom, opened the closet, retrieved a locked metal box from the top shelf. She hesitated once more, holding it in both hands. The man near the hallway shifted his stance. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "This keeps your son out of trouble." She handed over the box. They didn't count the money in front of her. They didn't rush to leave. The taller man filled out a single-page form, tearing off a carbon copy and placing it on the table. "Temporary federal hold," he said. "You'll be contacted." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "If you talk to anyone about this, including local police, it complicates things for Ethan. I wouldn't recommend it." 12 minutes after they entered, they were gone. Linda stood alone in her dining room, staring at a piece of paper that didn't list a badge number she could remember. For nearly an hour, she did nothing. Then she called 911. What she didn't know yet was that, at 8:58 a.m., a patrol officer less than 2 miles away had already received a bulletin. It wasn't about her son. It was about 2 men posing as federal agents. The 911 call was logged at 9:47 a.m. Linda Harper's voice was calm, too calm, according to the dispatcher's notes. No screaming, no hysteria. Just clipped sentences and long pauses as if she were replaying events in her head while speaking. "I think I may have just been robbed," she said. "They said they were FBI. 2 patrol units were dispatched, not federal, local. Officer Mark Reynolds arrived first, 12 years on the job, no history of complaints. He parked down the street, not in front of the house, standard practice when impersonation is suspected. When Linda opened the door again, she was visibly shaken but coherent. She handed over the paper the men had left behind. Reynolds didn't need long. No badge numbers, no case number, no field office contact. No formatting consistent with federal seizure documentation. The language was wrong, vague where it should have been precise, overconfident where it should have been procedural. Within minutes, a supervisor was called. Linda repeated everything: the knock, the threats, the references to her son, the money. She described the men carefully: height, build, haircuts, the stitching on the jackets. She even remembered the smell: clean, sharp, like industrial soap. Then came the detail that shifted the entire response. She mentioned that one of the men had warned her not to call local police. That line alone reclassified the incident. At 10:12 a.m., Aurora police notified a regional task group tracking a string of impersonation cases across 3 counties. Same approach, same pressure points, same promise. This keeps your son out of trouble. In 2 prior cases, victims had refused entry. In both, the men had left immediately. Linda was the first who opened the door. By 10:26 a.m., traffic cameras pulled images of a dark gray Ford Explorer leaving the neighborhood. No plates on the rear, temporary tag on the front, expired. At 10:41 a.m., an officer 2 miles south spotted it parked behind a strip mall. The men were still inside. They weren't running, they were waiting. What police didn't know yet was that the suspects believed the window between the crime and federal verification was much longer. They assumed local police would hesitate. They were wrong. By the time the 2nd patrol unit arrived at the strip mall, the Ford Explorer was already rolling. Slow, controlled, no panic. The driver obeyed traffic signals, used turn signals, the kind of driving that said one thing clearly. Adrenaline was not part of their plan. Officer Reynolds later testified that this detail bothered him more than anything else. The stop happened at 10:49 a.m. routine on paper, high risk in reality. Both suspects complied immediately, hands on the wheel, calm faces, no sudden movements. When asked for identification, they produced laminated credentials, high quality, convincing at a glance but just slightly off. The seal placement was wrong, the font inconsistent. Still, the men didn't argue. They expected scrutiny. Inside the vehicle, officers found 2 FBI-style jackets, a leather folder, and a locked duffel bag in the rear cargo area. When asked about the bag, the taller suspect responded evenly, "Evidence under federal hold." That statement triggered protocol. Aurora PD contacted the FBI's Denver field office directly. No intermediaries, no delays. At 11:07 a.m., confirmation came back. No agents with those names, no operation in that area, no authorization for asset seizure. At that point, the stop became an arrest. The duffel bag was opened on scene. Inside, neatly bundled cash, rubber banded, labeled by amount, exactly matching the sum Linda later reported missing. The suspects didn't resist, didn't ask for lawyers immediately. Instead, they pivoted. They claimed a misunderstanding. Said they were contractors. Said the woman had voluntarily handed over the money. Said everything would be cleared up once their supervisor arrived. No supervisor ever did. What escalated the case wasn't the money. It was what detectives found on their phones. Detailed notes, addresses, names, family structures, prior convictions. One folder was labeled parental leverage. Linda Harper's name was there, so was her son's. By the end of the day, federal charges were being discussed, not because the suspects were FBI agents, but because impersonating them carried heavier consequences. And because this wasn't their first stop. By the following morning, the case had already outgrown Aurora. What initially looked like a localized impersonation scam was now being reviewed by a joint federal-state task force. Not because of the money, but because of the method. The suspects were identified as Daniel Price and Michael Kerr. Both American citizens, no prior violent felonies, no history that would have put them on a standard watch list. That was the first red flag. Their backgrounds explained how they moved so cleanly. Price had worked private security for nearly a decade. Courthouses, corporate offices, temporary federal buildings during renovations. He knew access points, knew uniforms, knew how authority looked from the outside. Kerr had a different skill set. He'd spent 4 years working for a data brokerage firm that specialized in risk profiling. Legal on paper, morally gray in practice. Public records, scraped databases, debt filings, minor arrests, all aggregated, packaged, and sold. Together, they built something precise, not random targets, not high-net-worth victims, parents. Specifically, parents of adult children with minor criminal histories, enough to create fear, not enough to raise alarms. The task force reconstructed their process step by step. First, data selection, then address verification, then A single in-person approach, never more than once. If entry was denied, they left. If entry was granted, they escalated. No weapons, no violence, just pressure, legal language, and the implied weight of federal authority. Linda Harper wasn't chosen because she was careless. She was chosen because the data suggested she was compliant under stress. The most disturbing detail came from CARE's phone: audio recordings, short clips, rehearsed lines. Practice tones: if you don't cooperate, we'll come in ourselves. This is about keeping your son out of trouble. I wouldn't recommend calling local police. They weren't improvising, they were running a script. By late afternoon, investigators realized something else. The duo had stopped operating 2 weeks earlier than expected, which meant Linda's house wasn't the end of their run. It was the interruption. And that raised one question the case file couldn't ignore. How many people never called 911? By the third day, the narrative had split into two competing versions of events. Price and CARE claimed the entire situation was a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. According to their statements, they were running a consulting operation that helped families navigate federal investigations. No force. No threats, just advice and voluntary asset safeguarding. They insisted Linda Harper had handed over the money willingly. What complicated things was that, on the surface, some elements supported that claim. No forced entry. No physical injuries. No weapons recovered. No audio or video from inside the house. That ambiguity mattered. Defense attorneys leaned into it immediately. They argued psychological pressure was subjective. That fear wasn't a crime. That impersonation alone didn't automatically prove coercion. The prosecution disagreed. They focused on structure. The fake credentials, the rehearsed language, the explicit warning not to contact police. The categorization of victims as parental leverage. But the collision point came from an unexpected source: Linda's phone. During a forensic review, detectives found a voicemail timestamped 4 minutes after the men left her house. She hadn't noticed it at the time. The caller ID was blocked. The message was short: "This is Agent Price, just confirming you did the right thing today. Sit tight, we'll be in touch." That voicemail destroyed the defense's timeline. If the interaction had been consensual consulting, there would have been contracts, follow-ups, documentation, not reassurance calls designed to reinforce fear. The voicemail also proved something else: intent. They hadn't left and moved on. They were managing the aftermath. By the end of the week, federal prosecutors made their decision. Charges were filed for impersonating federal officers, interstate fraud, and coercive theft. Bail was denied. The defense requested a suppression hearing. The prosecution welcomed it. Both sides knew what was coming next. Everything now depended on whether the court recognized psychological authority as force. The hearing date was set. And for the first time since that knock on the door, Linda Harper was told the same thing by every official involved: this will end. The suppression hearing lasted less than 3 hours. That alone was telling. The defense argued consent, voluntary cooperation, emotional interpretation. They pointed to the lack of physical force and repeated that Linda Harper had opened the door herself. The prosecution didn't argue emotion, they argued structure. They walked the judge through the sequence: impersonation, authority assertion, threat of unlawful entry, implied harm to a third party, extraction of assets, and post-incident reinforcement. Each step on its own might have been ambiguous. Together, they formed a closed loop of coercion. The voicemail sealed it. The judge ruled that the money was obtained under false federal authority and sustained psychological pressure equivalent to force. The evidence stood: no suppression. Within 2 months, Daniel Price and Michael CARE accepted a plea deal. Price received 11 years in federal prison. CARE received 9 years, reduced in exchange for cooperation. Restitution was ordered in full. Linda Harper got her money back, but the case didn't end there. Through CARE's testimony, investigators identified 6 additional victims across Colorado and Wyoming. 2 never reported the crime. 1 assumed it was legitimate. Another was too afraid to ask questions. That detail changed how the case was classified: not a scam, not impersonation, a systematic abuse of perceived federal power. The FBI issued a public advisory weeks later, outlining exactly how legitimate agents conduct home visits and, more importantly, how they don't. Linda declined interviews. She returned to work. She avoided the news. In her final statement, she said only this: "They didn't take my money first, they took my certainty." The case file closed with a simple conclusion: nothing about what happened was violent, and that's exactly why it worked. The interview aired 6 months after the case was closed. Linda Harper didn't want to do it at first. She declined twice. Then a third time. What changed her mind wasn't the attention, it was the volume of emails forwarded to her by the prosecutor's office. Messages from strangers who said they'd watched the case unfold and realized how close they'd come to something similar. A few wrote that their parents were exactly Linda's age. Living alone, keeping cash at home, trusting uniforms more than instincts. Linda read them all, then she agreed on 2 conditions: no reenactments and no dramatic edits. The segment was filmed in a neutral setting, more like an HR training room than a TV studio. No harsh lighting. No ominous music, a single camera angle. Linda seated at a plain table, hands folded, posture straight, looking into the lens like she was speaking to one person who needed to hear it. She looked older than she had in the court photo used during the trial, not weaker, more careful. "I want to be very clear," she said early on. "They didn't get in because I was naive. They got in because I was scared, and because I thought fear meant I had to comply." She described the mechanics of the encounter with the same restraint she'd used in her 911 call. No emotional spikes, just facts. The calm, she explained, was part of what made it dangerous. "They didn't threaten me with a weapon," she said. "They threatened me with uncertainty, with the idea that if I hesitated, I'd ruin my son's life." When asked what people should look for, she didn't hesitate. She framed it the way the detective had framed it for her later: patterns over personalities. First, urgency without documentation. Real agents don't rush you into irreversible decisions at your front door. They don't rely on pressure, they rely on paperwork. Second, threats tied to silence. The moment someone tells you not to call a lawyer or not to call local police, that's your answer. Legitimate authority doesn't need secrecy from other authorities. Third, vague authority. They used big words but avoided specifics. No case number, no office name, no supervisor you could actually reach. They talked like people who didn't want a trail. Fourth, a forced choice. They made it sound like there were only 2 options: cooperate or face consequences. That's how scams work. Real systems have steps. Real systems have time. Linda said she wished someone had told her one sentence years earlier: "You are always allowed to slow it down." She explained the difference between being polite and being compliant. In her words, politeness kept the conversation safe, but compliance handed over control. "You can be respectful and still close the door," she said. "Closing your door is not aggression, it's a boundary." At this point in the interview, the reporter asked a question Linda had clearly prepared for: what to do in the moment practically when someone claims to be federal law enforcement. Linda answered like she was reading a checklist. Step 1, keep the door closed, talk through it. If they're real, they'll deal with it. Step 2, ask for identification through the glass and ask them to hold it there. Don't open the door just to see it better. That's a trap. Step 3, ask for a case number and a field office phone number, not a number they give you on a card, a number you verify independently. She explained that after her incident, detectives told her the simplest verification method was the one she hadn't used. Call the local police non-emergency line and ask them to confirm an active federal presence, or call the FBI field office using the publicly listed number. "And if they push back?" the reporter asked. Linda didn't smile. "Then they're not real." She also addressed the money, the detail that viewers fixated on. "Real agents do not take your personal savings because it's safer," she said. "If anyone says they need to hold your cash to protect you, that's not procedure. That's theft with a costume." Linda emphasized that criminals don't need perfect fake badges. They need you to feel isolated, rushed, and responsible for preventing disaster. Then she talked about what she hadn't said publicly before: the shame. "I kept thinking I should have known better," she admitted. But shame is part of what they're selling. It keeps you quiet. It keeps you from calling anyone. It makes you feel like you participated. She said the fastest way to break that cycle was to treat the moment like a business decision, not a moral test. "No one gets to audit your life on your porch," she said. "Not without paperwork." Near the end of the segment, Linda pulled a small piece of paper from her wallet, creased, rewritten, and folded like she'd handled it hundreds of times. It was the checklist she kept taped inside her pantry door. Cop it again to keep with her. No warrant, no entry, no badge number, no conversation, no verification, no compliance, no threats, no trust. She paused before the last line, then added it quietly, as if she was saying it to herself more than to the camera. "If someone tells you cooperating quietly will make things easier for your family," she said, "that's not law enforcement, that's leverage." The interview ended without music, no closing statement from the network. Just Linda standing up, unclipping her microphone, and walking out of frame with controlled, deliberate movements. The same kind of control the men had tried to project in her dining room. The case was officially over. But the lesson, she said, wasn't, because authority doesn't need to be loud to be dangerous. Sometimes it just needs to sound confident enough to be believed. If this breakdown helped you understand how easily authority can be weaponized, subscribe. Cases like this don't get simpler, they get quieter. Like the video if you think more people should know how these situations actually unfold. Write in the comments, have you ever been in a situation where you genuinely questioned whether the police or authorities were acting legally?